Good afternoon and welcome. This webinar is brought to you by the St. John Paul II National Shrine. My name is Dr. Daniel Meola and I work in the Mission and Ministry Office at the Shrine. I'll be serving today as your host and moderator for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just say a few words about Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. Evangelium Vitae is the longest papal encyclical ever written, which suggests that St. John Paul II considered it central to his papacy, that he would spend so much space writing it. In Evangelium Vitae, St. John Paul II famously describes a clash of cultures, the clash between the culture of death and the culture of life. At its deepest level, Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, describes the emergence of a culture of death as a culture that denies solidarity between all persons, especially the most vulnerable, because of the eclipse of the sense of God and of man. Therefore, to recover and build a culture of life, we must give a resounding yes towards the solidarity of all persons, concretely manifested through the way in which we lovingly accompany the vulnerable and the suffering. This is an accompaniment grounded upon what St. John Paul II describes as the contemplative outlook upon life. This outlook recognizes more deeply God's presence in our midst and in the dignity of man. To help us foster this contemplative outlook today, we'll be featuring Chrisanne Valancourt Murphy. Chrisanne Valancourt Murphy is the Executive Director of Catholic Mobilizing Network, the national Catholic organization seeking to end the death penalty and promote restorative justice. With 25 years of experience working at the national level in faith-based advocacy, Chrisanne co-authored Advocating for Justice, an evangelical vision for transforming systems and structures. Chrisanne has been quoted in sources such as the New York Times, CNN, American Magazine, Crux, National Catholic Reporter, EWTN News Nightly, and featured on Just Love Radio on Sirius XM. For more than a decade, Chrisanne served as senior staff at Bread for the World, a collective Christian voice urging our nation's decision makers to end hunger. She also served as executive director of Witness for Peace, a politically independent, faith-based national grassroots organization committed to promoting peace, justice, and nonviolence in the U.S. foreign policy. In the late 90s, Chrisanne was an associate with the Latin America Working Group, one of the nation's longest-standing religious coalitions dedicated to a just foreign policy in the region. And in 1994, Chrisanne worked along migrant farm workers in Woodburn, Oregon. She has a master's in theology degree from Boston College, formerly the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Chrisanne and her husband reside in Washington, D.C., with their 3 children. Chrisanne will be speaking on the Gospel of Life and restorative justice. We will have a question and answer period at the end of this webinar, so please be sure to type your questions in the Q&A box below. We'll do our best to get through as many as possible. So let's get started. Chrisanne, welcome.
Good to be here, Daniel.
So I'd like to start just with a question about the Catholic Mobilizing Network in general. Can you please tell me a little bit about your work and your special connection to restorative justice?
I'm happy to. But first I want to say, Daniel, that I can't help but look at what's behind you in the mosaic of the National Shrine and just tell you how it warms my heart. The St. John Paul II National Shrine has been a wonderful collaborator with Catholic Mobilizing Network. And I can think of 2 times that I just want to tell people about. Once we were there because the Archbishop, the Papal Nuncio, Archbishop Christophe Pierre, said a mass for prison ministers right there in that. And then secondly, the National Shrine also hosted a wonderful couple, Kate and Andy, Deacon Andy Gromere, who lost their daughter, Anne, to a violent death. She was murdered, and they talked about their path to forgiveness through restorative justice right there in the basement of the shrine. So I just feel such a kinship in what I'm seeing and being with you all today.
Thank you. We love collaborating with you all as well, and thank you for being part of our work, and we're glad to be part of your work today. So can you please tell us a
So can
little
I
bit?
please get to the point, right?
No, no, no,
Yeah.
no.
No. So Catholic Mobilizing Network has been around for about 10 years. We're about a decade old. We started originally in 2009 as a response to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops campaign to end the use of the death penalty. And the organization started so that we could amplify and animate that pro-life teaching of the church. There are many ways to get involved with ending the death penalty, and a small organization, a small but mighty organization working on repeals and commutations, clemency, and just educating about how ending capital punishment is actually key to our life outlook and building a culture of life in the United States. So we do a myriad of education, advocacy, and prayer to end the use of the death penalty and to promote restorative justice. That's been key to who we are and how we see the work since our very inception.
Yeah, and just speaking about restorative justice for a moment, in case some of our audience is not familiar with the concept, could you please explain some of the principles of restorative justice from a Catholic viewpoint?
Absolutely. Well, we say that we're against the death penalty, but we're also for something. We're for restorative justice. So looking at crime and harm and violence in not necessarily the sense of what law was broken, but more who was harmed and what we need to do to heal that harm. That is more of a philosophy of restorative justice, understanding crime and wrongdoing in terms of people and relationships and those being broken and needing of repair. So we believe that restorative justice and its practices of either circle process or restorative practices where you're holding up and upholding the dignity of the human person, of both the perpetrator and the victim, those processes and that outlook can more model clearly Jesus's reconciling way.
Thank you. And now, just to talk a little bit about the prisoners themselves, especially during the situation of COVID-19, can you please describe to our audience some of the major unique challenges, both pre-COVID and post-COVID, spiritually and materially facing prisoners?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking that question. What's happening right now behind bars in terms of people who are living and working in prison and jails and detention centers is quite devastating. It's severe. We know that across society and the general population, we've had to shelter in place, we've had to quarantine, we've had to keep our social distance, and all of that is incredibly difficult inside prison. There are 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in the United States, and that is more people than incarcerated than any other place across the globe. So what's in the time of COVID is that it's kind of like an avalanche of virus spread in the prison system. Right now, we know that about 30,000 people behind bars have been diagnosed with the virus, and then more than 400 people have already died with the virus. And that's just from the tests that have been given and what we know with the reporting. And we do know that the reporting is quite inadequate. And depending on where you are and which county and which jail and which prison system, state or federal, the guidelines have varied and had been adhered to differently. So it's an anomaly out there. We don't know exactly how many people are who are affected. We don't know how many people are affected at the moment. One thing that we do know is that prisons, they're overcrowded and they're under-resourced, often with their medical facilities. So again, this just causes more despair for people who are behind bars. Visits from family and friends, from their attorneys, from prison ministers who are giving spiritual support, giving out the sacrament, the Holy Eucharist, anointing of the sick, etc. All those are things that people look forward to behind bars. They are kind of the levers for relieving some of the stress and the anxiety and the fear with the isolation. And all that has been cut back now, for safety and health reasons. there's very limited visitation, if any. And so people who are in prison right now are finding themselves ever isolated, often, having to wait their turn to make a phone call, without adequate resources, sometimes without enough soap, or certainly not hand sanitizer, which is limited in prisons. So there are just barriers upon barriers and devastation across the board.
Thank you for alerting us to that problem, and we'll talk a little bit later maybe about some concrete things that we can do. But just to stick with this question a little bit too, what are some of the spiritual needs of prisoners? I mean, pre-COVID, currently, you mentioned already about dealing with loneliness, but even pre-COVID, and how is Catholic Mobilizing Network and the partners that you work with trying to alleviate that? So what are some of the needs, and how are you trying to alleviate that?
Yeah. Well, mostly what Catholic Mobilizing Network does is education and advocacy and prayer, for people who are thinking about this issue. We have a partner organization called the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition that helps to focus more specifically on the needs of people who are incarcerated, and also the needs of prison ministers. How do we get people adequately trained and resourced and well-formed, and certainly educated with trauma healing, because so many people behind bars have been exposed to neglect or poverty or abuse. These are recurring themes. So making sure that people who are tending to the needs of prisoners are well-formed and informed. Again, Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition is a great resource for them. I wanted to mention one other thing that's happening, that's sort of a brighter side of COVID. I think it's been a time where state and county officials, even our federal government, has had to look at some policy, alterations in this time, some ideas that have come out pre-COVID that are diversionary to incarceration. For example, people who have been accused of a minor crime, a nonviolent crime, that they be off-tracked and not actually incarcerated, and just increasing the population. So there's home confinement where there's been some kind of crime committed, but again, not to incarcerate that individual. Or in this time of COVID now, enacting compassionate release, where people who are close to their date of release could get actually released earlier and lessen the population in that way. Or for people, again, who've had nonviolent crimes or medical necessity, they could leave early. So again, to decarcerate. So those are some of the ways that we can do something right now. And these are policies that don't have to be just because of COVID, but because we know that part of the rehabilitation and the social integration means that we just don't need to keep people locked up forever.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising our awareness about that. And we have to have compassion, because that's part of the reform process. And I love the whole way you frame this question too about restorative justice. It's also about reforming the harm done within the individual who committed the crime, as well, helping them with the trauma that they maybe had that contributed to leading towards the crime. But a reform in the spiritual sense too. So I love that you partner with Catholic Prison Ministry, because once upon a time, correct me if I'm wrong, but they used to call it prison penitentiaries because they were doing penance. So the sense of like reform has been somewhat lost, but you're keeping that alive with restorative justice. So thank you. And yeah, I don't know if you want to say more about reform, but thank you for that focus.
Well, I think that, the way that we conceive of people kind of doing time and what's at stake, in some cases we know that people in serving their sentences actually come out hardened criminals, right? Like actually they come out more knowledgeable about how to commit crime than they understood going in, so how are we, what are we doing to rehabilitate and socially integrate in healthy ways people back into society? and not just further shame and damn and punish out of sort of a sense of vengeance or some ill-conceived notion of justice. It's certainly not the kind of justice that God intended, especially when each of us has a God-given dignity. We need to honor that at all time.
Yes, and speaking of dignity, you mentioned briefly about ending the death penalty. Now, I want to draw our audience to a quote from the Gospel of Life on this topic. So bear with me, just it's a little bit of a long quote, but I'd like you to comment on these passages, Chris Ann.
Sure.
In the Gospel of Life, Pope John Paul II comments in reference to the death penalty that it's a sign of hope that there is, quote, growing public opposition to the death penalty, and that modern society, in fact, has the means of effectively suppressing crime by rendering criminals harmless without definitively denying them the chance to reform. Later on then in the encyclical, he says, quote, the problem of the death penalty must be viewed in the context of a system of penal justice ever more in line with human dignity, and thus, in the end, with God's plan for man and society. It is clear that for these purposes of ensuring safety by protecting society and reforming the criminal, the nature and extent of the punishment must be carefully evaluated and decided upon, and not go to the extreme of executing the offender except in cases of absolute necessity. In other words, when it would not be possible otherwise to defend society. Today, however, as a result of steady improvements in the organization of the penal system, such cases are very rare, if not practically non-existent, end quote. Can you comment on these passages and their significance for understanding the moral question of the death penalty?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think it cannot be overstated what a role Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II had in changing the course of the death penalty in this country. The U.S. bishops have been calling for, abolition of the death penalty for a couple of decades, and it charts pretty closely to Evangelium Vitae, because it was clear in this country that society could be kept safe, and that there was no need to take a life in order to keep, for the common good. And so I think Pope John Paul was saying, cruel and unnecessary. He was really starting this path of, we don't need to do this. And then when he came to the United States in 1999 to St. Louis, and he called the death penalty cruel and unusual, or cruel and unnecessary. And then he went on to actually submit to the governor of Missouri to pardon someone or to stay their execution. The person, I believe his name was Darrell Meese, who was the next to be executed. And the governor at that time actually accepted that and gave the Darrell a life sentence instead of execution. So, the Pope was saying we really don't need this any longer. And so I think we cannot underestimate the role that Evangelium Vitae had in creating this framework for the culture of life and including right in it the ending of capital punishment. So to this day, I think we have, St. John Paul II to thank for really starting us down this path. I guess I would say that, it really strikes me that we're thinking about Evangelium Vitae and its anniversary, and it brings up, Pope John Paul II's visit to the United States over 20 years ago, because just last week, Missouri executed potentially an innocent man, Walter Barton, who was Catholic, and he was accused of and sentenced because of a killing of a woman who was 81 years old, his landlord, Gladys Cooler. And he had 5 trials, and he maintained his innocence from the very beginning. And his case was full of, false testimony and, faulty evidence, a number of attributing facts that we often see in innocence cases. So we'll never know if Walter Barton was innocent or not. But it's just, 20 years later, we still have so much work to do. Here, there was at first a commuting of a sentence, 20 years ago from the governor of Missouri. Fast forward 20 years, and even in this time of COVID, when there has been kind of a halting of executions for the last 2 months, it's been a strange silver lining to the COVID pandemic, but true. And, just last week, we had our first execution since. So, it's a strange irony, but I think it points out how much work we have to do. The other thing I would say is that the cases of innocence are quite prevalent when it comes to the death penalty in the modern era of capital punishment, which is since the mid-70s. 167 people have been exonerated from death row. That's pretty incredible. And it's estimated that 1 in 9 people who are on the row are likely to be innocent. So we cannot, ignore the innocence factor here and how deeply flawed, geographically concentrated, racially biased this immoral system is. So, the culture of life and the way that St. John Paul II talked about this, I think has pushed us to this trajectory to really use our faithful witness to end the practice here in the United States.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that just such a tragedy of the Missouri case. And yeah, that's a tremendous argument in the favor of abolition of the death penalty, that mistakes can be made. And I know
And they are made.
I know Pope Francis, they have been made. I know Pope Francis has mentioned that too as well, and he's been very strong about abolishing the death penalty. So again, thank you just for bringing to light those tragedies. And just to continue to build on this question, in the Gospel of Life, St. John Paul II also stresses the importance of a contemplative outlook upon life as necessary for a Christian engagement with people. At one point, he describes it as Christ's concern for the stranger, even to the point of loving one's enemy, which has that's an utterly unique command in the history of mankind, to love one's enemy. In what way does this Christian outlook of mercy and love for one's enemies inform your work? And as St. John Paul II says, the height of this love is to pray for one's enemy, for by doing so we achieve harmony with the providential love of God.
Yeah, thank you. I think that for me, the prayer and how prayer and love informs this work, I think where I need to pray, and I think we're all invited to pray most fervently, is when we are tempted to dehumanize those who are in prison. When we are tempted to imagine that some lives have less value than others, and that they're disposable. And I think when we look at the massive incarceration, when we look at this tragedy of capital punishment in our country, we have to try to humanize and understand kind of our brothers and sisters who are behind bars, and understand their needs. So I think that we can all pray for more mercy, more compassion. Some of us remember when St. John Paul II visited prison to his would-be assassin, Mehmet Aliaga. In 1981, he was driving around in an open-air Pope Mobile in St. Peter's Square, and he was shot 4 times. And he lost a severe amount of blood. He was in intensive care, and gratefully he survived. His would-be assassin was caught immediately and put in prison. And 2 years later, St. John Paul II went and visited him and forgave him and befriended him, and later called for his pardon. So I think this witness, his symbol, his actions, teach us the extent to which we are to give mercy and be merciful. So I believe that's for all of us. We're called to pray fervently for mercy. No one is excluded from God's love. And so again, the times that we're tempted to see anyone as less deserving of God's love and mercy means that we need to rely more on God and trust in God's compassion and love for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a rich Christian concept. And speaking of St. John Paul II's encounter with this man, this is a huge part of our exhibit and his legacy that we promote. What's fascinating about that story too is that he wasn't asking for forgiveness, at least initially. I don't know, I haven't followed his story down the road, but John Paul II still went and still forgave him unilaterally. So that unilateral forgiveness was just really powerful for me to also be the first to make that act of forgiveness, even when they don't necessarily ask for it. And I'm wondering if you have stories that you could share with our audience of these heroic examples of unilateral forgiveness, maybe by families, maybe communities, that sort of put a face to this idea of mercy that you're promoting.
Absolutely. Well, I'll mention again, Kate and Deacon Andy Gromare. I mentioned them in the beginning. They live in Tallahassee, Florida. You can look up their book, Kate Gromare, Grosmaire, and their daughter Anne was murdered by her boyfriend. They were very young, and he was a friend of the family, and they had an argument, and he had anger kind of management issues, and it was an accident. He ended up, she ended up getting shot and dying, and so the Gromare family, Deacon Andy talks about it. He was in the diaconate, and he was learning deepening his faith and his understanding of church teaching, and they immediately thought, we need to go see him. We need to go see Anne's boyfriend who had shot her, and they immediately kind of embraced him, just his humanness, and they were able to talk to him. They were able to go through a restorative justice process, even in this capital case, which is the first in Florida. And so they were, they got involved with the son's family, and so both parents from both sides kind of came together and actually had a restorative justice process where they could talk about what happened. They could have some questions answered, and they could just work through the process of healing. And it's not been an easy road, but it's a path that they chose because of their faith. So I think people like the Gromares can offer incredible stories of Herculean forgiveness. And, forgiveness is not to be forced. They offered forgiveness voluntarily, much like St. John Paul II. Forgiveness is not something that we will forgive if the other person asks for it. It's something that we need to do kind of for ourselves in our own healing. And if that person asks for our forgiveness, in turn, that's a gift, and that's a powerful act. But there's so much there about our own healing and our own recovery from trauma when we can be transformed in a restorative process. Another friend of mine, Vicki and Syl Schieber in Maryland, their daughter, this was a very different kind of case. Their daughter, Shannon, who is my peer, she was in the Wharton School of Business. She was 23 years old, and there was someone who came into her apartment, broke in the middle of the night, raped and murdered her. The Schiebers are incredibly faithful individuals, and Vicki has spoken on, about ending the death penalty for decades now. But it's families like that say, please don't kill in my name. I'm against the death penalty. I want someone to be accountable for their crime, but I don't want to take another life, because that just perpetuates the violence and the grief and the agony. They say, if your trauma is not transformed, it will be transferred. And in this case, the Schiebers said, we don't want to transfer our trauma onto anyone else. We want to speak about the value of Shannon's life and the things that she loved, and they've done many things to honor her life in positive ways, but not take another life, because for them that would be dehumanizing and a devaluing of Shannon's life and their faith. So there are so many heroes out there. some that are, you know, of our same faith tradition, some that are on the road to forgiving, some who are, you know, just kind of coming to terms with their own story. But God offers abundant mercy. And I think, you know, there's much work to be done to walk with people, to accompany them on that journey of forgiveness.
Wow, those testimonies are so powerful. I was tearing up a little bit over here listening to you. And just what examples of love of our enemies. I mean, just you see how alive that teaching is and how real that is in the lives of the stories you told. That's not just some fancy, you know, fairy tale wishful thinking on the part of God, but is truly informed those lives. And their response is just, to me, just so touching. So thank you for sharing those. I have one more question. I just want to remind the audience, please, to use the Q&A box for our live question and answer period with Chris Ann. She's incredibly knowledgeable, so please take this time to learn about restorative justice. So please ask a question in the Q&A box below. My last question is, the Gospel of Life speaks about the necessary solidarity between all persons. How can people not engage directly with accompanying prisoners like me be in solidarity with them in general, but also through your work specifically?
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you're asking, and it's good timing because Catholic Mobilizing Network and a host of other national Catholic organizations just last week released a statement of solidarity, a national Catholic response to COVID behind bars. And how this came about was we were in many conversations about how devastating COVID is for people who are in prison. And although, you know, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Catholic Health Association, Catholic Charities USA, although they're on the front lines of helping people and creating policies that are going to support people through this crisis, and also always mentioning people who are in prison, we recognize that right now, experiencing COVID from behind bars could be a de facto death sentence. And so more needed to be said about what's happening. And so a number of organizations came together, the ones I just mentioned, you know, the USCCB, 5 bishops who are heads of their committees, 5 different committees within the Conference of Bishops, the head of Catholic Health Association, Sister Mary Haddad, Sister Donna Markham, who's the head of Catholic Charities USA, Catholic Mobilizing, the Catholic Prison Ministry Association, Dismas Ministry, the Jesuit Conference, and the Order of Malta. We all came together. They do an extensive amount of work in prisons, especially through their Pen Pal program. So these organizations that all have a vested interest in what's happening behind bars came together with this statement so that we can emphasize that during this time of COVID especially, there are no throwaway lives, and that we need to ensure that the dignity of people who are behind bars is upheld at this time. And so we can't pit one vulnerable community against the next. So what we do is we offer a way for others to join us in signing this statement of solidarity. Already on Catholic Mobilizing's website, we have over 1,600 individuals who have signed. We have nearly 100 national Catholic organizations that have signed, and again, a tremendous original endorser list. So we would ask people to sign in solidarity, and then to, at their own level, be it in their local jail, in their state prison facility, in their federal prisons that are in their area, tune in to what's happening, especially around Congress, around the next stimulus package, or other, you know, policies in local areas that pertain to people who are in prison. Look for, you know, ways that you can help. And again, encourage legislators and policymakers to keep people who are in prison and that vulnerable population in mind in ways that we can support going forward.
Thank you, Chris Ann, and we'll be sharing some of those resources at the end, as well as some books if you'd like to read up more about this. And if people want to learn more about your organization and get involved, what's the name of your website?
Yes, so Catholic Mobilizing Network's website is Catholics Mobilizing.org. And you can find anything on that website, from more about the statement of solidarity to the ways that we help people who are facing imminent execution, including the federal government's recent reinstatement of federal executions after 17 years. So we have information on that. We have prayer resources, we have educational materials, recommended readings, our own books, testimonies, etc. So lots of resources at catholicsmobilizing.org.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we turn it over to the audience in their Q&A?
Well, I would just say that ending the death penalty is very possible in this country. Over 25 states have ended the practice right now. A number of them through moratoriums, a number of them through state repeals, so they no longer have the death penalty on the books. So we're more than halfway there. There's about 10 states in the union that don't use it very often, like haven't used the death penalty in the last 10 years. So we are so close to passing this full abolition. The churches behind this, our country's support of the death penalty is waning. And honestly, the death penalty is dying a death in this country. So it'll take every single one of us to bring it over the finish line. And Catholics have a strong voice. Often, there are Catholic leaders, governors, policymakers. So we can speak with our faith conviction on this issue, on this life issue, and we can really make a difference.
Okay, thank you, Chris-Ann. Our first question is, capital punishment tends to get overlooked within the pro-life context. How do you address this, especially when the media often frames pro-life simply as anti-abortion?
Mm-hmm. I think that's often the case. I think that, from a catechesis perspective, from a Catholic formation perspective, and then from our own faithful witness, I think we need to keep bringing up that all life has value. And so it's from, the womb into the tomb, and we need to see that trajectory of life and stand for life at every age and every stage. And I think that there's wonderful stories out there. We need to use our voice in creating opportunities, letters to the editor, doing more formation at schools and in churches, in social ministry contexts, in small group and Bible study contexts. We need to use every opportunity to lift up the value of life. There's a lot of work to do. I don't think we should allow the bifurcation that happens. We know it happens, but I think we can stand against it, because we have the hope of building the culture of life behind us. We have the teaching of the church. And so we need to be that witness.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, could you please describe the process of restorative justice that you spoke about in relation to forgiveness? How is it determined which perpetrators and victims could potentially benefit? How does the process take place, etc.?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's something that is kind of very customized for each case. In the most extraordinary of circumstances, after much time and much work, both internal work and then the work of facilitators who come alongside maybe the victim and the perpetrator or the offender, sometimes you get to the point where you can do a victim-offender dialogue, where you can actually have the people who were involved in the crime or the harm meet, and they can, have conversations, answer questions, and have discussions about really what the impacts were of the harm, and then move to some making a right relationship if that's possible. I will say that those cases are few and far between. They take so much work. Sometimes cases are brought forward where a victim will meet with other offenders, or offenders will meet with not the victim in their specific harm or their specific case, but other victims of a similar crime. Because often there's similar feelings, emotions, circumstances. And so even some of that treading in those waters can be healing for both sides. The process of restorative circles or peacemaking circles, where you can bring the person who has been harmed some of their support people, some facilitators, the offender, some support people for the offender together. That, you know, that could be 10, 12 people. I mean, depending on the situation, it can be, you know, more than just a few. And that sometimes starts a long road to just being able to see that this person is a child of God on each side of the case. But circle process is something that can be used not just in, you know, kind of in criminal cases, but it can be used in ministry, you know, just to create safe spaces so people can have deep and meaningful conversations where there's harm, where there's strong emotion, where there's shame or broken trust, etc. So those are just a few of the practices. I will say that Catholic Mobilizing has 2 books that I would recommend. The first is Redemption and Restoration. The second is Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity. And in both of those cases, I think you're going to share it in your show notes, Daniel, but in both of those books, you know, you can learn more about these practices, how they align with our faith, with mercy, with human dignity, with Catholic social teaching principles. And one principle, namely that you mentioned, Daniel, solidarity, how we can be a reconciling people, and tools that we can use to get there. So I would recommend both of those resources. There's a lot to learn about restorative justice, but we can use it in every aspect of our personal, professional, ministry, and communal lives.
Thank you for those resources. And yes, we'll have a slide here sharing those resources and also in the show notes as well. The next question is, he says, thank you so much for the very informative presentation. Could you speak a little bit about how to foster a collective and individual attitude of seeing the human dignity of all people, especially in light of recent events such as what happened in Minneapolis and Central Park?
Yeah, George Floyd. Yes, I think that our way out of the division and the demonization is to hear each other's stories and to see each other as humans. When we just, you know, create these camps, these tribes, if you will, and make assumptions about people from the start without really understanding who people are, I think we go down a slippery slope. So I think that in ways that we can encourage dialogue, encourage what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, you know, where we can meet people and see them as God's creation in God's image, listen to their stories, listen to their hurts, their needs, their joys, and their hopes. I think when we can do that, we can be more authentically Christian and better Catholics. It's not an easy road, and there's no magic fix, but I do think, you know, St. John Paul II and our current Holy Father, I think that they've both said many things that can help us get there.
Yeah. The next question is, how do you see the principles of restorative justice as you're applying them in the penal system can serve as inspiration and guidance, whether in the church or in our personal lives with hurts or abuse?
Yeah. Well, I think the principles of restorative justice, as I've mentioned, you know, honoring the dignity of everyone involved, and lifting up the needs of the victim. I think in all of these cases, in the church, in our personal lives, in the penal system, when we can see all sides and see their dignity, I think that's just the beginning.
Okay. And now the last question I have here from the audience is, what are some common misperceptions about restorative justice, including possibly the prevalence for recidivism?
Yeah. I think the common misconceptions of restorative justice is that it's soft on crime, that it doesn't want to keep people accountable, that it's kind of, you know, like tree hugging or, something other, some other, kind of really soft and squishy idea. But what we know about restorative justice, and people tell us this who've been through restorative processes, is that when you admit to the harm you've caused and you sit face to face or have some contact and listen to the hurts that you've caused, and take responsibility, that's harder than any sentence, And so I think that there is accountability and there is an ability to move forward with restorative justice. It's not just to kind of let it go and can't we all just get along? It's not that at all. It's actually calling something deeper from all parties involved, from each of us. And so, so I think that there are misconceptions, but the more that we know about it, expose ourselves to restorative practices and learn how to integrate them into our lives, and ultimately how we want to shape the communities and the society around us, I think we all can grow tremendously and ultimately, in our case, become better Catholics for it.
Yeah, and just to dovetail on that, as you were talking, I was thinking too that that's really the best self-defense too, because often, the death penalty, et cetera, is saying it's necessary to deter crime, et cetera. But the best way to defend society is to reform the person. So you have a whole nother person on your side collectively trying to reform whatever level of influence he has, even if it's in the prison system. So yeah, it's anything but squishy, as you say.
Yeah. And the stories are out there, on Catholic Mobilizing Network's website, we have the Hope Over Death blog where we show, where we tell stories, and mostly, people tell their own stories and we lift them up, about how they're using restorative practices in their ministry somehow, and how it's life-giving and how it's creating an alternative to this vengeful, retributive system. And so I would encourage folks to look at that. If they want more stories and practices and examples, visit the Hope Over Death blog.
Wow. So that's other ministries. So like they're applying the principles, say, to their own
education.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like in the school system, for example, my kids are in school in DC. DC does lots of restorative practices, inside, for younger learners. When it comes to colleges, Catholic colleges, campuses are taking on restorative justice in their student life and how they're handling kind of infractions on campus. And, there's so many ways we can use this, even in the context of the church, even in the context of sexual abuse. There are some wonderful examples of devout Catholics who are taking this on and working on the abuse crisis and using restorative principles so that there can be real healing and real moving forward.
Wow, that's wonderful. Yeah, I can see the overlap. And just out of curiosity too, while we're on this and applying the principles of restorative justice to other fields of ministry, have you seen anything done, for instance, like with homes, like children that have come from broken homes? It's an area I like to focus on.
Absolutely. We partner very closely with Precious Blood Ministries of Reconciliation in Chicago. They're on the South Side, and they work in their community. There's many people who have been affected by incarceration in one way or another, but it's also, with juveniles who come from broken homes. They have all sorts of restorative circles so that they can, build community and bring forth that kind of dignified identity, and create safe spaces so people can talk about some of the trauma they're experiencing in the home, in their circumstances, and then begin to heal. And it's really incredible how God can work through the stories of other people, through their testimony and their witness. So, we don't need to have a magic solution. Sometimes we just need to embrace our brothers and sisters and accompany them. And we find that we grow in the process, and people are, again, transformed together. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Okay, thank you, Chris Ann, for joining us today. Now I'm going to share some resources that she put together for us, just to go through them briefly. Opportunities for actions. She mentioned the Statement of Solidarity, a Catholic response to COVID-19 behind bars, in which the USCCB has also gone behind as well. And also their Mercy in Action project, which has a lot of concrete ways to get involved. And some of the recommended resources that she mentioned if you want to learn more about restorative justice, redemption and restoration, a Catholic perspective on restorative justice, and harm, healing, and human dignity, a Catholic encounter with restorative justice. Thank you so much for your time, Chris Ann, and these resources and the very informative presentation. And please, dear audience, please make sure to support the Catholic Mobilizing Network and all the good that they do. And finally, I just want to leave you also with a few other resources that the John Paul II Shrine is bringing to you during this time that the shrine is closed due to the coronavirus impact. We're planning several future online events to help bring the shrine to you. Please be sure to visit our website or follow us on social media, including YouTube, to learn about upcoming virtual events, upcoming webinars, view exclusive digital content like our Art of Prayer series, streaming Mass online, streaming rosaries during the month of May, and streaming the prayer at the Hour of Mercy. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Chris Ann.
Good to be here. Thanks, Daniel.
God bless everyone. Stay safe and be well.